This is the Circle Day Show on Resonance 104.4 FM. Joining me is Anarch and Re-Education Shorts, anarchists, educators who have a strong online presence. You can find their content on social media platforms such as TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Should anarchists work with communists given the backstabbing we have historically been subjected to?
Yes, but it's a yes, but yes, you should work with communists. I work with communists all the time. They're not evil, scary people that are going to bite you. They're just regular people who have a difference of opinion. A lot of people can read a lot of different bits of information from a lot of different sources and come away with different ideas. But at the end of the day, the communists are going to be your closest allies at the moment. Is that going to continue in the future? No. Absolutely not. So you have to be wary, you have to be cautious, and you have to be preemptive. You have to know what's going to happen next. And that's a good reason why you should read history, read theory, know what happened in the past. If we're working together to do certain things, like for creating dual power structures, for example, it's really hard to organize a dual power structure egalitarian thing without it following anarchist principles. I've seen it many, many times where somebody will try to create a free food pantry, but they'll have a hierarchical structure in the background, and it inevitably just devolves into chaos every single time. Promoting the ideas of mutual aid, promoting the ideas of anarchism as being a leadership of ideas and not of people is the best way to move forward and to actually create those structures together in a way that is going to enforce egalitarian ideal. That's the way to do it. Some communists talk about how important Soviets were or how important community councils are and how important democratic systems are and that sort of thing, right? Use that to your advantage. Work with them, use those methods. Those are inherently anarchist, but once they try to start seizing control or seizing power or doing little things to try to take control of your group, that's when you know that something is up and you have to have a contingency plan for that. So make one.
What is decentralization and why would it be a good style of organizing to adopt?
The more people know how to do all of the different things within a group, the stronger that group is going to be. If you have these hierarchical organizations, you cut the head off, and all of a sudden the entire group just devolves into chaos or completely becomes confused. They have no idea how to handle things independently. Whereas when you're using decentralized organizing structures, there's always those other people in the wings that know how to organize, they know how to put this group together, they know how to take the notes, they know how to do the interviews, they know how to, whatever, schedule trucks or whatever you're doing. So that's a definite positive for having decentralized organizational structures. The other important aspect of it, too, is that it is much harder to destroy a decentralized group than it is to destroy a centralized one. What do I mean by this? Well, a centralized group makes it very easy for you to know who the leadership is, so you know who to bribe, who to threaten, who to take out, all of those sorts of things, right? It's an inherently weak structure unless in certain specific instances where they're able to seize a lot of power very quickly. In those cases, it's a different sort of thing. When these groups are being created, COINTELPRO easily walks in and just says, okay, Bob's their leader. Let's deface Bob and turn him into an evil dude. Right? And make everybody in the group hate Bob. And then it happens. Decentralized structures are much better for fighting against this because nobody knows who the leadership is. And most of the time, random individuals that are just there to do the job are potato peelers. So they are just there to deliver the food, to drive the trucks, to join the meetings and that sort of thing. They're just regular people. They don't know how the structure is all operating until they've been there for a while and they start working together and they get involved in the deeper community and that sort of thing. It's a much more robust vetting process and it's much harder to destroy. We can't be putting people into positions where they don't know how to do it, at least not at first. And we have to learn how to work together and how to play to those strengths, right? In a lot of meetings, for example, I'm the one that leads the meeting, right? Not because I'm special or anything like that. It's just
Egomaniac.
because What's that? Sorry?
Egomaniac.
Yeah, it's not because I'm an egomaniac. It's just because I talk a lot, right? I'm a chatterbox. So I'm able to lead, but it doesn't mean that I care about leading the meetings. Like if anybody else wants to do it, they can and often do. And lately, I haven't led any meetings. It's been all up to everybody else. But at first, yeah, that was essentially I fell into that role. Nobody else wanted to do it, so I did it a lot. Other people who really like typing and stuff like that, they would take the meeting minutes. Other people that didn't want anything to do with the organizing, they would jump into a truck and they would just deliver food. We all play to our strengths, and that's the important thing about decentralization.
What is the difference between personal property and private property?
So, this is a common question, and it's a very simple answer. Personal property are the things that you yourself own and use. So, that can be your toothbrush, your car, your house, your TV, your couch, those sorts of things. They are your property. Private property, on the other hand, has been conflated to be the same thing as your personal property, but it's a very different thing. Private property is the means of production, the material, equipment, factories, and land that is used to create the fundamental things that we need to survive. That's the difference. And when somebody says that they own them the same way that you own your car, then that creates an incredible problem because the means of production is what keeps us alive, whereas your car just drives you from A to B. They're very different things.
Could an anarchist militia defend itself come an imperialist war of aggression without a military state infrastructure?
I think maybe not an individual militia, but, a federation of militias, perhaps. Insofar as we're pointing out some of the flaws in historical anarchist thinking, here we come back to the problem with too individualistic of an approach. 5 to 10 people in an affinity group that all know how to use a gun, that's not going to be enough to keep people safe. That's not going to be enough to put pressure on the state to change things. What you will need is networks of militias. You will need structures of agreement. You will need coordination. You will need education upon tactics and consistent understanding of tactics among a large group, which means you will need large-scale structures. And once again, not hierarchical structures, but large-scale horizontal structures, structures of confederation or federation, depending on which term you prefer. And this is what has led to anarchist success in the past. If you look at Makhno and the Free Territories, the Black Army, or if you look at the CNT-FAI in Spain, these have high degrees of coordination and structure. These are not just these kind of willy-nilly affinity groups that just do as thou wilt. These are people that have training, modes of distribution among them, that have modes of complex communication and agreement and strategic coordination. As with everything that anarchists have to do, we have to build that from the ground up. That's the challenge that is in front of us.
I know how to shoot pretty well, actually. I've been training, so I'm good there.
I'm
Self-defense
glad to hear it.
Self-defense only.
I think that we've seen small guerrilla forces fight off large domineering states and be successful at it many, many times throughout history. A lot of talk right now is around 2002 about how the United States went to war with Iraq and Afghanistan and all of that. And even if you look further back in Vietnam, what ended up happening? Smaller factions of guerrilla forces fought off the Imperial Corps and won. They constantly have won. In fact, America hasn't won a war probably since, I would say, World War II. And even then, it was kind of Russia that beat the crap out of the Nazis anyway, and not America. So even then, it's tenuous to say that they won a war. They definitely dropped a bunch of bombs and killed a lot of people, but they didn't necessarily even win that one. When it comes to all of these accusations that anarchist militias or small groups of guerrilla bands fighting against the Imperial Corps, they would never win because the Imperial Corps has nukes and bombers and drones and all of these sorts of things. It's not like that. Imagine an old car. An old car has roll down windows. It's a very simple machine. You can get under it. You can fix it whenever you want. The more elaborate that car becomes when it has computer consoles and automatic windows and electric starts and self-driving capabilities, one little thing goes wrong. You see that with a Tesla truck, and the entire thing falls apart. Complex structures are very weak, and even though they seem like they're incredibly strong and incredibly capable, they often fall to the simplest of things, and you have to keep that in mind.
That's why fascism always crumbles from within. Just not sustainable.
Absolutely.
What's your take on why mass shootings happen in America? Is it purely a gun control issue that the state claims? And should we be wary of the state's rhetoric of disarming an entire population?
I love the slogan "under no pretext." Should the arms and ammunition be removed from the proletariat? Because eventually, at some point, you're going to need them. The problem with America and gun violence, and I'm talking about this as an outsider looking in, I'm Canadian. I believe that it's a gun culture problem, and that stems from capitalism itself. Guns aren't necessarily tools for revolution in America, though they might be branded that way. They're collector's items, they're status symbols. They are, fun toys that you take out on the weekends, that sort of thing. It's not actually seen as anything that can be used towards fighting for a better future. And that's the main problem with gun violence in America, is that all of these sorts of ideas about how guns should be used and that sort of thing, it ends up culminating into this culture where people believe that property is worth more than people, and that people should have their lives taken if they do the simplest of infractions. It goes all the way from the military to the cops to the common person on the ground. And the thing about the common person on the ground with the gun that's causing the mass shootings is they're overwhelmingly right wingers.
And
Because right wingers, sorry,
and racist as well.
and
And misogynist.
racist right wingers, the worst possible people on the face of the earth, they're the ones that are committing these mass shootings. And of course they are, because they're told that leftists or that progressivism, any number of other things, even politicians, they are all against them. The entire structure is all against them. And what are they supposed to do about that? Well, they give you the solution. And like I've said before, you can pry it from their cold, dead hands. The solution is to go out and create those problems and create those shootings.
Can you speak about the importance of holding space for getting things wrong as we individually learn more and evolve over time? How a healthy, reflective dialogue can be a beneficial way to embody the change we are promoting?
I think this is actually one of the biggest challenges of any society. And I don't think that it's even unique to anarchists, is this question of what are your standards around disagreement, conflict, harm, abuse, ignorance, as opposed to deception, right? Like these are all slightly different categories that all require that we approach them in different ways. I think that one of the problems we see, not just among anarchists, certainly, but among the modern left, is that we really mix these categories up routinely. We turn disagreement into hurt. We turn hurt into harm. We turn harm into abuse. We have a hard time discerning between them, to the degree where I think some people are being genuinely deceptive in how they try to portray the outcomes of these events, which sometimes are just simple disagreements, sometimes are just simple character conflicts where certain people just, it's like the two of you aren't going to get along, and that's fine. You don't need to fight anymore. Just stop. It's okay for you to just be in the same space and not argue. It's also okay for you to just argue. It's okay sometimes for there to be conflict. Conflict can be healthy, but I think what we see is a lot of people who aren't able to practice a healthy conflict, that they have a very toxic, self-centering sort of mindset that destroys coalitions. That's an anti-solidaric impulse. And it's back again to the indigenous way of thinking of these problems. This isn't to say that that's like, that everything's going to be like, unicorns and gumdrops or whatever. Like sometimes people do bad things and they don't want to get better. Sometimes people are toxic. Sometimes people are bigoted and they don't want to get better. That is a problem you're going to face. And I think that's really the key, is that this default should be that when a person does a bad behavior, we ask ourselves how we might try to encourage them to do better. And we enter into a process where we actively try to get them to do better, not through haranguing them, insulting them, breaking them down, but instead in a process of good faith and education. And that is where you're really going to discover what that person's character is like. If that person then responds well to that, listens, makes clear efforts to get better, then y'all need to just hopefully just let that be in the past. Maybe you can accept that that person has those biases and they're working through them, and that's valid to understand, but it's time to move on if the person is making efforts to get better and continually may need some kind of feedback. That should be our default. But I find that people have very little patience, very short fuses when people do things that upset them. And I unfortunately think that that is a huge impediment to us possibly building any kind of liberatory movement.
So one of my main mantras is that I want to be correct about as many things as possible and incorrect about as few things as possible. And I think the way to achieve that is to allow yourself to be criticized, allow yourself to be wrong, and accept when you are wrong. I hate this thing that a lot of content creators and influencers do, where they're caught in a lie or they're called out about something and they double, triple, quadruple down on that thing. It's incredibly unhelpful because it convinces the audience of falsehoods and also makes you feel like you're right regardless of what happens. And you're not. At the end of the day, we all make mistakes, and you should embrace those mistakes, find out what they are, and then try to be better and try to learn from them. It's the most simple, obvious thing in the world. You can never be correct about more things than not if you're not willing to know where you're incorrect.
What does international solidarity struggle look like?
We're all fighting together for the same sort of goals because the real problem isn't Joe down the street or Francis in another country, right? It's the people above you. It's the power structures and dynamics that keep you in place, that keep you in chains. That is the real problem. And having that solidarity across borders is obvious. Borders are created to keep us apart from one another, from creating that class solidarity. So as long as we are all fighting for the same goals to destroy this unjust justifiable system and create a more egalitarian one, then I believe that is class solidarity across those lines. And it's not just borders that prevent us from having that class solidarity, right? It's everything. It's people from the coast hating the people in the middle of the country, people in cities hating the people that are in the rural areas, people hating black people, gay people hating, well, straight people hating gay people. And all of these divisions end up creating this situation where we're all put into these individualistic little boxes. And every time a new category is created, these boxes get smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's physical, it's mental, it's in reality, and it's in subspace as well, or cyberspace. You're physically cubed up at work. You're physically cubed up when you drive. You're physically put into a situation where you don't live with your family or parents or anything like that when you're at home. You're physically put into these boxes and alienated from your fellow man, from your fellow human beings. And you're also mentally put into those boxes when it comes to ideologies and religions and all of these different things that create these divisions.
Is there space for technology in an anarchist society? And does technological advancement look different with a ruling class as opposed to without one? For instance, the ethics for open source over access to information only through a paywall, is it a question of entirely different perspectives?
That anarchism and technology works perfectly well hand in hand. I would actually say the problem starts when we create this capitalistic barrier, right? When we create the barrier of money from us being able to use the technology that we've already created to be able to benefit humanity. If we were able to use all of the technology that we've created to benefit us and not them, then we would be working far less, right? We wouldn't have as many hours during the day that we spend doing something that we hate. We would be able to utilize technologies that were created decades ago and were put on a shelf and hidden away from us because it would destroy the bottom line, that sort of thing.
Why can't we have a billionaire class, infinite wealth in the hands of a few if we are serious about progressive change? Isn't removing their wealth simply theft?
No, because theft would imply that they actually owned any of the things that they stole. And at the end of the day, you can't become a billionaire or a multinational corporation or somebody that controls large swaths of land without having first stolen that stuff from the general public. So as far as I'm concerned, it's not taking anything that they own, it's taking back something that they stole.
How can we define fascism, and can it come under any guise, such as forms of religious or corporate or nationalism?
I think we can define fascism. That being said, I have not released the work that I'm currently writing where I'm attempting to do so. I think that academia has gone a lot of different directions in answering this question. Some of them have kind of taken this stamp collecting approach where they just want to give a name to every specific permutation of how the government functions. That's an illiberal democracy, and that is a nationalistic democracy, and that is just ethnic nationalism, whereas that that is fascism and that is Nazism. And I think that this misses the forest for the trees. I think that a radical analysis is generally one where what we're doing is we're looking for the overarching systemic features that are common to all of these manifestations. So, for example, when we talk about capitalism, we're talking about a set of core features that define a capitalistic system. And we find those core features in a bunch of places. And yeah, we could talk about a bunch of permutations of capitalism, but ultimately we're talking about a system that is implemented in many different ways in many different places, but remains capitalism. And I think that we have to essentially derive an understanding of fascism that is the same. And insofar as that's the case, what I think fascism essentially is, fascism is essentially a form of regression within the shell of capitalism. It is a desire to go back to feudalism or some form of monarchy, but being incapable because the feudal mode of production is gone. There's no bringing back the feudal mode of production as it was. Everything is now based in the accumulation of capital, and that has completely and fundamentally reoriented the economic system that underlies society. So no matter how powerful they are, they cannot buck the current economic system, but they wish to recreate the sort of features of power distribution. They want to bring back a very, very, very hierarchical mode of state control. So they're hoping to return to a time when you have lords and some form of serfs, this form of kind of bonded labor. They're hoping to have like absolute power within some very centralized executive. And I think that the only thing that really characterizes it from monarchy is that it is stuck within capitalism. And so that's what I view fascism as. I think that it is appropriate to call it a form of reaction. It is a form of reaction within this mode of capitalism, a desire to return to a state of existence which can't be anymore. And you'll notice that therefore it becomes attendant with all of these sorts of outdated ways of thinking. This extreme adherence to a nationality, this extreme adherence to a single religious ideology based in myth. It's based in deception. These features which were much more characteristic of the monarchic order, where it didn't really matter what the truth was. There was this sort of, widely proliferated philosophical conception of the world, and that was a mode of control. Under capitalism, this is a post-Enlightenment society. We desire pluralism to some significant degree, philosophically. Well, the fascist wishes to return to a time where there's less pluralism. They wish to create a single unified structure of understanding. Of course, there are strong synthesist features within all of these fascisms we see, but they are always seeking to consolidate this into a single ruling ideology. And this is why you find that there is a lot of infighting within the hierarchical power structure. There's this strong form of competition to create a single unified ideology, a single unified central form of control, which gets rid of all forms of deviation because they view deviation as degeneration. They think that it is essentially, a poison, a sickness within this like nationalistic bloodstream, I guess you might say. And so this is the fascistic impulse. It is to view progress, it is to view the progress of history as itself being a form of degeneration. They view a previous way of being as being the superior way, kind of as we were discussing earlier. But I think the reason why this view of fascism would have trouble catching on in academia is that academia is fundamentally liberal, and this would sort of, buck a lot of their understandings of what fascism is. This would require a radical analysis, which they would reject at its core.
Fascism is a very complicated and very difficult thing to just in a couple of seconds describe. But the way that I usually think about fascism is that they usually have a cult of personality. There's a cult of history where they revere things that happened in their past. It's essentially guided by this idea that a certain group of people should be in control of everybody else. It may be based on race, it may be based on nationality, it may be based on country. And that's essentially what fascism is. Another way to describe it is the white blood cells that come out whenever capitalism is starting to decay. Fascism comes about to hold on to that power and make sure that the people that are in charge don't lose their spot. So there are many different forms of fascism, right? You can have corporate fascism, you can have post-racial fascism, which is something that I've been hearing about lately a lot. Essentially, the idea is that they have a strong man, strong small group of people that everybody shows deference to, and they have to do whatever they say. We've had corporate fascism in America, in Canada, in the imperial core pretty much from the start. We didn't call it that necessarily back in the day. We call it that now, but it's a recreation of the same sort of things that we've always had. Monarchism is a form of fascism, depending on how you stretch the definition. Authoritarianism can be a form of fascism, depending on how you define it. So all of these different structures, again, getting back to the power dynamic and the hierarchy thing, all of these different structures just recreate the domination of the oppressed versus the oppressors.
How does geopolitics impact on a local level? Why is it our business, the oppression that others face?
So when we're talking about geopolitics, essentially we're talking about the ruling class of another spot on the world sending their children and the workers that are just like you out to die. We are them. We are the same as all of them. And at the end of the day, we have to be thinking about all of us together as a unified humanity and not just as these individualistic countries and states. It's not helpful to think of us that way because the class dynamics between us don't match up to that sort of structure. The dynamics between us might be cultural differences, they might be religious disagreements. Sure, that is a possibility. But the main difference between us is not the person beside you, it's the person above you, the person or people that are controlling everything. And as long as we're convinced that the people on the other side of a border are the bad guys and that the people that are above us are not, then we're never actually going to be fighting the real problem.
Do anarchists have all the answers, or is adapting to a new world full of uncertainty a work in progress?
No, anarchism does not have all the answers. It would be the height of hubris to assume that we can just magically create every single solution out of thin air. That's not possible. But what anarchism does is it actively tries to find the best possible solution to get a more egalitarian society. That's what we're striving for. Is there still going to be problems in an anarchist society? Absolutely. But they're going to be different problems that we want to constantly work towards changing. And that's the main point about anarchism.
Well, I think it's probably impossible to have all of the answers. Maybe I just come from a very scientific perspective. In science, what we would say is like, no, science doesn't have the answers, but science is a methodology that we hope could find all of the answers. Not to, of course, compare anarchism to a science. I think that would be far overselling it. In fact, I criticize Marxists for calling Marxism a science in just the same way. But I do think that anarchism provides us a methodology for analyzing power structures, which is extremely durable and seems to be very flexible to nearly all portions of history. So you can take the anarchist analysis and you can essentially apply it transhistorically. The anarchist analysis is going to be very fruitful and it's going to tell you a lot about why everything turns out the way it does. And I think that it will probably be very durable into the future as well, which is to say that as society continues to shift and change, the anarchist analysis has, at least so far, stood the test of time very, very well. And I suspect that's just because anarchism has gotten a lot of very key details correct. But I would never want to say that it has, quote unquote, found all of the answers. Anarchism has spread across the planet. It has now been adopted by people in many different places. It is an ideology that has been informed by many different perspectives. Women, disabled people, all different sorts of ethnicities. Now we have a much more robust and intersectional anarchism because of it. So in my mind, it's a methodology for coming to understand how power structures function.
Money, 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 money. Capitalism centers money as an incentive. Money can be used as an IOU, but what are the negative control mechanism functions that money serves?
Insofar as we're talking about money as being a way to sort of quantify economic units, honestly, Marx laid out an incredibly good analysis of why that's a problem. In the modern day, so have Bickler and Nitzan in their work, Capital as Power. One of the fundamental things you run into is that as soon as you take something as complex as an economy, where you have resources that come from all kinds of different places, they have many different inputs of labor, ecological details about, over here, the same wood is grown, but the ecology doesn't grow it as fast, or if you grew it that fast, it would be damaging. And you take all of these features, it becomes damaging to boil it down to a simple number, because you are losing all of the complexity of the system in the process. So you take, this enormous array of detail and you boil it down to a number. And in that fact, you lose all of that information. It doesn't come back out. It never can be reproduced. You have to go gather it by hand if you wanted to get that information again. That's a very, very damaging process for trying to bustly model an economic system. Capitalism doesn't care, of course, because capitalism is happy to reduce complexity and embrace simplicity and so on. But I think for us, it's very damaging because we are hoping to create a system of direct distribution, which robustly takes into consideration all of those things. Another problem, of course, with money is the fact that it can be accumulated. And this is something that you see in a lot of leftist analysis, is this critique of accumulation. Accumulation leads to large disparities in power. And disparities in power aren't always a big deal, but the sorts of disparities we're talking about here are enormous disparities. And they become disparities in decision-making, disparities in access to basic goods and services, the necessities of life, and that is cancerous to a system. And furthermore, one of the problems is that capital or money is power. It's essentially the ability to dictate the flow of how society functions. And that power is recursive. It's exponential in its growth. If you have power, it's easier to get more power. And that grows and grows and grows. And if you have very little of it, it's that much more difficult to gain more. So these problems are very old problems. And there's more, this analysis has been carried out for well over a century at this point. But yeah, I think those are some of the major ones that come to mind.
Money is a funny little thing, right? On the smallest level, on your and my level, right? Money is the most important thing on the face of the earth. We need money to survive. Without a certain amount of money in our paycheck, we literally die. But as you go up higher in that hierarchical structure, money takes on a very different role. It becomes more or less a barrier that prevents other people from being able to obtain the things that they need, while allowing you to have, if you're rich, have anything that you could possibly want. And not just simple things, but also access to people's minds, access to people's bodies, access for the ability to actually send people to die for you. Money isn't just the simple number on a screen, though it is that for us. Money is a barrier of class. It's what prevents us from being able to move forward and what allows them to take control of us.
Money is power, and we're trying to dismantle power.
100%. Money is the physical form, and it's not even physical anymore. The digital form of power. That's all that it is. And you can see that when you look at the money. Who's on the money? It's the people in power. The stock exchange is an interesting example as well, right? Because for somebody on the lower levels, you can't even play in the stock exchange until very recently. Now you can a little bit, not really, but a little bit, and you can make a little bit of money there. But it's always been one of these things that there's a barrier of entry. You have to have whatever it is, 10 grand to be able to initially invest. It's a game that rich people play.
What is the culture of resistance? Can you point people new to anarchism to current societies that model itself on anarchist principles?
Yeah, so I actually started a series called Liberation in Action on my YouTube channel, which is tasked with precisely that. I've only covered, I think, 4 or 5 so far, but I have like a massive spreadsheet of examples of both currently existing societies and historic societies. I think a lot of people have this preconception that those are going to be 100 people or 1,000 at most or something, but some of these are polities of hundreds of thousands and even millions in some occasions. A form of libertarian socialism or a society predicated upon horizontal power structures. This has been proven all throughout history and in the modern day. It is feasible. Then there's also these projects that are arising sort of in the belly of the beast, like Sika Sosola and Fehuve. These are like council movements and worker cooperative movements, and these are arising within places like in Central and South America especially. But yeah, no, they've happened all over the world, and they've happened on every continent, and are still happening on every continent.
I would say that it's a culture that glorifies the idea of liberation, of actually fighting in a struggle to become free. That's what it essentially boils down to. When it comes to different organizations across the world that have fought for that liberation, there are many and have been many all throughout history. Some that come right off the top of my head are the fighters in Rojava. They have been working in a very egalitarian system for many, many years now. There was also the warriors, essentially, the CNT-FAI back in Spain during the rise and rule of Franco, and they fought against fascism, and they were able to create incredibly large anarchist structures and societies without having any kind of rulership or leadership. Of course, there's the Black Army led by Nestor Makhno. I love the Black Army, yes. They're so cool. I have a video about them on my page. The Zapatistas, right? They have been fighting for their liberation for decades now, and they're doing it in a very egalitarian, non-hierarchical way. Are every single one of those examples purely anarchistic? Not necessarily. But are they fighting for what we are trying to achieve? Absolutely.
Yeah, is there a reading list you'd recommend?
I have one right here. So a couple of really important books that I think that everybody should take a look at if you're interested more in anarchism. The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Absolutely, it's one of the baseline anarchist texts that really lays out what we want to achieve and how we can go about achieving it. Anarchism and Other Essays by Emma Goldman. A really great composium of a lot of different ideas that were thought of by Emma. We're on a first name basis. And it's just really, really awesome. You got to check it out. What is Communist Anarchism, or The ABCs of Anarchism by Alexander Berkman? This is my favorite book, bar none. I read passages from it probably at least once a week, and it's imperative, kind of one of the most important pieces of work that I've ever stumbled across, that goes through pretty much every single question that people have about anarchism and answers it incredibly well over 100 years ago. And then I'll just quickly go through a few more. Ecology and Freedom by Murray Bookchin, Nonviolence Protects the State by Peter Gelderloos, Full Spectrum Resistance by Eric McVeigh, Sabotage by Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Read this book. Everybody out there, read this book, please. And also Debt, The First 5,000 Years by David Graeber.
How does a sense of a superiority complex hold humanity back?
In a lot of different ways, right? We have the superiority complex of the boss versus the employees, the king versus their subject, white people versus black people, straight people versus gay people. Essentially, the superiority complex thing is a structure that has been recreated again and again and again to essentially reinforce structures of domination. It goes back into a lot of the different things that we were talking about moments ago, about how borders and dividing lines end up creating all of these intricate little groups and boxes and so forth and so on. Those superiority complexes are what essentially forces you to stay inside of that box. And it also, because of the structure of our system, it reinforces those ideas. So people that have a baseline, like say you're narcissistic or whatever, those sorts of things aren't checked in capitalist society. Those sorts of things are enforced and encouraged even. Like you can make tons and tons of money if you're willing to sacrifice others for your own personal gain.
I think we've actually covered a lot of those ways throughout this discussion, especially when we were talking about humanity's conception of its role in relation to nature and its relation to animals, or non-human animals, we should say. I think those are definitely some very significant barriers, this feeling we have of superiority. But also, it of course exists all throughout our society. You know, our coalitions are riven by these sorts of feelings of superiority and inferiority and desires for social climbing that I think sometimes people are perhaps not even aware of, but can be very toxic. These, I think are going to exist in any society. I'm one of these people that I'm not a utopian in the sense that I don't believe in a perfect society. I don't believe in a society where there's no conflict, where people are not going to try to get one over on each other sometimes, where there is not going to be antisocial activities. These are always things that are going to exist. In my mind, the reason why I'm an anarchist is precisely because I think anarchism is the system best oriented to reduce the spread of these behaviors and to make these behaviors harder to accumulate into bigger hierarchical structures. I'm trying to produce a system in my mind, which is like, I guess you might say, the best immune system against those things. These arise even in our communities. And it's actually another reason why I am so pro-organization, because I have seen how if you just kind of leave the communities to be extremely loose, where it's all affinity, you get sort of illegible hierarchies. You get these hierarchies that people are maybe not even aware of, that are very subtle, and you get behaviors of social climbing, which are very unhealthy and for which there are no formal mechanisms to address. So I think that organization is one of our best ways of counteracting these features, the superiority complexes, the desires to be better than.
With geopolitics hotting up and the prospects of a World War III looming, why do wars even happen? Is it essentially a global status opportunity to consolidate more power among capitalists? And why does the population generally participate rather than seeing it for what it is, utter carnage for the working class?
There are not really all that many reasons why it does happen. Primary categories are inter-imperialist wars, wars for land or money, or revolutionary wars, class wars, wars of the people against their oppressors. And the reason why we have so many of these inter-imperialist wars is so that they can get more profit, so that they can get more power, so that they can enrich their buddies, capitalists who want to exploit the oil of a global south country. That's why we end up having a lot of these wars. It's always been like this. It's always been the same. It's always been the children of a country fighting against the children of another country so that some rich ass can make a whole lot of money and give it out to their friends, or be able to take more land, which can in turn give them more wealth. That's why these things happen. And propaganda, it's also the manufacture of consent. And manufacturing consent isn't something that has to happen in the moment. It's something that also happens over time. So once you've had the consent and propaganda and all of that sort of stuff manufactured in the population, it's easier to do the next time, and even easier to do the time after that, because we've already, like Pavlov's dog, become convinced that that's the way to handle that sort of situation. Till we realize we have to point our anger upwards rather than sideways, we're going to continue to fall for that propaganda.
Well, I think this is a feature of all hierarchical power structures. Or I should say, all power structures seek to perpetuate themselves, and that includes horizontal power structures. Horizontal power structures seek to perpetuate themselves. They just don't perpetuate themselves, we would hope, through domination. Their perpetuation takes place through solidarity and mutuality, and self-defense, I should note. But hierarchical power structures, they seek to be the only hierarchical power structure. They want absolute control. They see the existence of all other hierarchical power structures as competition, and they really only have two dictums. It is either to destroy the other one or to consume the other one. So we see this with the United States. The United States really only has two modes of dealing with its enemies. It either tries to destroy them outright, or it tries to find a way to coup them, recuperate them, and turn them into vassal states in some capacity. This is really not unique to the United States. Every hierarchical power structure in history, if it had the same power as the United States, would seek to do the same thing.
Cultural domination as well. The US have been great at that.
Yes, absolutely. When you have that much power, when you have this extraordinary concentration of power, you also then have power to control the narratives that are produced at every scale of society. You create the underlying basis of everybody's conceptions of the world through the media, and I mean to say through artistic mediums, but also through, journalists, but also through academic analysis. Once you have created a society where the default is hierarchy, it reproduces hierarchy at every juncture. This produces a mentality or psychological disposition, which I've called hierarchical realism, referencing to Mark Fisher's capitalist realism. So capitalist realism has been said, it kind of paraphrased as, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. There is no alternative, as Margaret Thatcher said, right? Here I'm basically taking this same conception, but I think that's the way we think of hierarchy. We think of hierarchical power structures as being the only way anything can be done. There's no alternative to hierarchy. This is the dominant conception in society. And everything sort of works as one big machine to reproduce the hierarchical society. So that obviously is going to filter down into people's psychologies and their expectations and their ideologies and even their religious conceptions, which were perhaps at one time more liberatory. Even those can become highly hierarchical in their conceptions. That's the danger of a hierarchical society socially reproducing itself. I focus on power structures because I think that it's good to think of these as systems, you know?
Thank you both again, Anarch and Re-Education Shorts.